Let's go straight to Moscow, where the one and only Donald Courter awaits. Donald, welcome back to the mother of all talk shows. I've just been looking at some very impressive pictures of you at the International Film Festival, where you were sitting with some very impressive people. Tell us first about that film festival and how your own film is doing.
Well, thanks again for the invitation, as always, George. It's a pleasure to be on your show. I love it. And in terms of the film festival, this film festival that I was at, it was in Tula, actually, a major Russian city that's south of Moscow. And it's one of the biggest war film festivals in Russia. It's sponsored by pretty much all the state media channels, Russia Today, the First Channel, Russia 24. It's also sponsored by the Russian Presidential Fund for Cultural Initiatives. So it's a big, high-profile thing. And I was actually really honored to have my documentary film that I directed with Jeff Monson called 8 Years Before, about the Donbass conflict, to be in this film festival, to compete for an award, with which it actually did. This is I was able to get the Crystal Award at this film festival. Wonderful. For a great Donbass documentary. And and at the actual screening, what I wanted to really mention on your show was just how many young people were actually there. The room for the screening of our documentary was filled with Russian young people. And I was really happy to see this, because the point of this documentary film was not only to bring the truth of what happened in Donbass 8 years before the military operation began, to show that to people in the West, but to show it to anyone who might not have an idea. And a lot of these Russian youths right now are looking for answers when it comes to the conflict going on there.
Is the film still on YouTube, Donald? Can people still see it?
Yeah, you could still see it. My YouTube channel, for some reason, has not been blocked. The Revolution Report. It's called 8 Years Before. There's an abridged version and a full version. I highly suggest people watch the full version, because there's some really cool interviews, really heart-wrenching interviews, I have to say, that Jeff and I actually filmed when we were in the Lugansk People's Republic and the Donetsk People's Republic, with civilians who suffered at the hands of the Ukrainian military, at the hands of Ukrainian neo-Nazis, and they tell their stories, essentially. This is a narrative formed through the voices of people who actually live in Donbass and suffered throughout those 8 years before the military operation began.
The unkindest cut of all for these people is the post last year, the denial of the calvary that they were forced to endure for those 8 years, even amongst circles, and media circles in particular, that had relatively comprehensively reported on the suffering of the people in the Donbass before the start of the military operation. The level of cynicism involved is quite extraordinary. Television and newspapers that wrote about the Nazis, the Azov battalion, the right sector, the shelling and indiscriminate murder of Ukrainian citizens in the east of the country for 8 long years, that was all suddenly wiped and dispatched to the memory hole. That's why your film is so very important.
Well, yeah, I appreciate it. I mean, originally, this film was it was filmed in 2021. This film was actually supposed to bring international attention back to the Donbass conflict that had left, most of the mainstream media. Like you said, there were some media outlets reporting on it in the West about Ukraine's neo-Nazi problem. You can even find an article on the internet by the Atlantic Council saying that Ukraine has a neo-Nazi problem, and that, no, this is not a Russia Today article. Like you said, this was all actually documented in the Western media, and we wanted to bring more attention to that. And it's just after the military operation began that we decided to change the purpose of this film to be basically a vehicle of information to show people in the West why Russia launched the military operation in the first place. Because like you said, the narrative changes, all of a sudden the political goals change. All of a sudden, Western foreign policy changes. All of a sudden, Russia is the big bad enemy more than it was before. And now Ukraine doesn't have a neo-Nazi problem. Now they're calling Putin Hitler, as ridiculous as that is, saying that Russia resembles the Third Reich. I myself am a communist. I would not live in a country that resembles the Third Reich if that were the case.
Talking of changes, how do you account for the fact that in March, which is not that long ago, let's face it, Bakhmut, Artemovsk, was of such strategic value that Zelensky was demanding, begging, cajoling for a major resupply of ever more powerful weaponry in order to defend it, because he said that if it falls, it will change the course of the whole war. Now that it's fallen, we have the same media that reported him and his demands telling us that the fall of Bakhmut is of no importance, and they can't even understand what all the fuss is about.
Well, of course, they're just trying to, play everything down when they've taken a catastrophic loss that they didn't expect they were going to do. I mean, now, obviously, Zelensky's narrative here is that even though Bakhmut was lost, it was somehow a victory because Russian troops lost significant amounts of, they took heavy casualties, even though no evidence has been put forward to suggest really actually how many casualties the Russian military and the Wagner private military company sustained. And also no information has been put forward as to how many Ukrainians and essentially NATO mercenaries have died there as well. Of course, we know it's been a bloodbath, but the reason it's been a bloodbath is because both sides have long understood that Bakhmut or Artyomovsk is a very strategic city. And now with it, in Russian hands, we may see a sort of turning point in the entire military operation to begin with, where Ukraine is really going to be on the back foot more than it was before. And another indication of why Bakhmut is of course of strategic importance is that the Ukrainian military, even though they've been pushed out of the city, are trying very hard to outflank Russian forces that are currently controlling that city. They're still trying to get a hold on it as much as possible. And then also we've got Zelensky accusing Russia in Hiroshima at the G7 summit, accusing Russia of being responsible for all the destruction that took place in Bakhmut, saying that, basically likening it to the kind of nuclear destruction that happened in Hiroshima that the United States committed back in 1945. But obviously it takes two to tango. And unfortunately, it is a terrible thing, war, and the fact that Artyomovsk has been destroyed. But it is the Ukrainian government that started this conflict in the first place.
What do the Russian public, you're out and about all the time, has this changed, do you think, the point of view of the Russian public? Do they sense that the tide has turned, that the war will be finally won, that it then will be over, that a conclusion can be reached, or are they dug in for the long haul?
Well, I think everyone is prepared to be dug in for the long haul, but the news of Bakhmut coming under the liberation of Russian troops, is of course good news for people here. It's good to hear specifically that news right now, because it's been in the media for a long time as a strategic point, like we were just talking about. It's been fought over very intensely for a very long time. And of course, in the mainstream media all over, there have the more recent significant changes along the front line have admittedly been kind of negative, right? We had the Ukrainian counteroffensive that, took significant chunks of the Kharkov region back, as well as the capital of Kherson. When, news like this happens, it's disheartening for a lot of people. But we're seeing here a very significant victory that is obviously raising the morale of people here, even though it never went very low, to be honest. We've been seeing these studies of Russian support for the military operation and the Putin administration throughout, the last year, and it stayed very high. I mean, the lowest I've seen it go is about 66% of the population, which is more than most Western leaders can say, that's for sure.
Well, the G7 has just assembled in Hiroshima, as we've been talking about, and not a single one of those leaders has the support of the majority of their people. As that well-known Bolshevik organ, the New York Times, pointed out, it is a club of unloved leaders. So even at its lowest point, and its highest point was well over 80%, the support of the Russian people for the war was overwhelming and strong. I'm just wondering, I've asked you this before, do you encounter any unpleasantness at all on the streets of Russia as an American? Because you surely would encounter some unpleasantness from some people in America if you were a Russian broadcaster and a filmmaker. How are the people reacting to you, dealing with you on a day-to-day basis?
People have been reacting to me in the most positive way you can imagine. I mean, think about this. I went to a Russian war film festival filled with, people who are very in support of the military operation. A lot of them have ties to the Russian military. That's why they go there in the first place, which obviously has long had a sort of generally, anti-United States government culture attached to it. But, they don't ethnically hate Americans. People there actually loved that there was an American actually coming over to Donbass, spending the time and effort to go there and show people in the West the truth through a documentary film. That's why they gave me an award in the first place, because they saw that I was doing something that most Westerners would not have dared to do, to actually go film a documentary in the actual war zone where, things were quite dangerous at that time. And it just goes to show the Russian people don't see this as a conflict between Russians and Ukrainians or Russians and Americans. They're not like, oh, we hate Americans, we hate Ukrainians. Although I have to say, I've noticed that sentiment in the West about Russians, where they're trying to basically erase everything Russian as something unpatriotic. But we got to remember, the Russians and the Ukrainians were brotherly peoples, and they still are, actually. I mean, in the Soviet Union, they were two republics of the same multinational country, and Russians still look at Ukrainians as their brothers. But there are, of course, neo-Nazi Ukrainians or nationalist Ukrainians, pro-Western Ukrainians, and there are Ukrainians that remember the sort of fraternal bond of the Russian-Ukrainian people that they shared throughout decades of the existence of the Soviet Union in their struggle against imperialism, against Western imperialism. So there are also plenty of Ukrainians who support Russia as well. That's something that is almost never covered in the Western media. Like, for example, the coverage of Ukrainian refugees. They're kind of being used as a sort of propaganda tool for Western media, trying to make Russia look to be the bad guy in this situation. But what they don't really show is that many of these Ukrainian refugees, they're not actually fleeing destruction caused by the Russian military or the war or anything. Many of them are fleeing, mandatory conscription, because people are in Ukraine. People are going around to people's doors and knocking on people's doors, saying, "All right, you're going to come to the military and fight Russia." And a lot of people are just not ready to do that, either for political reasons or because they just want to be left alone throughout all this.
Donald Coulter, good luck with the film. Congratulations on your award. The film is 8 years before, and you should definitely catch up with it on YouTube. Thanks for joining us, Donald, as always.